definitely wanted to start a family. The first time he met Stephanie, I felt like, they would be a good match for each other. Stephanie didn't really talk about her family or about her past. And it does make you wonder if there was more to this story than we know. She definitely had that Jekyll and Hyde kind of behavior.
Looking back on it now, there's some signs that we probably missed.
It's hard to think that somebody that I let in my life is capable of something so horrible.
Turn to 911.
Oh my God. I need help. Let me help. God.
Andy was my older brother. Everybody loved him. We did have a great relationship growing up. I was 10 and Andy had just turned 16 when my dad passed away. That was very hard. Andy was there and was ready to take on anything he needed to take on as the man of the house. And he made sure me and my mom were both very well taken care of. Andy always wanted to be a police officer for as long as I can remember.
I worked many years with Andy Kimbrell on night shift and through the different assignments. And he was the nicest, positive attitude, happy, eager, every definition that you could think of as a good friend, a good police officer, that would fit him to a T.
When Andy came to work for the Vestavia Hills Police Department in October of 2002, he was assigned to my shift. When you describe a police officer as to serve and protect, that's exactly what he did. Always wanting to do things for other people. A real happy, positive guy.
Andy and Dawn were high school sweethearts. Him and Dawn had a great relationship. You could just feel the love between them when you were around them. Dated for years before they got married. They were, beyond excited to welcome a child, and especially a little girl. They were thrilled to be parents.
He was the happiest he could ever be was when him and his wife had the baby.
I would say that it was a dream come true for him. And then subsequently, there were some medical conditions and medical issues that took a turn, and tragically, his wife passed. To say that his world stopped would be an absolute understatement.
Dawn passed away shortly after their daughter was born. He struggled. I'm sure, having a new baby was a lot for him, and then, shortly losing his wife was, a whirlwind for him at the time, and he was never the same.
Watching one of your own officers go through what he had to go through was very traumatic for all of us.
But, just like he did when my father passed away, he really just stepped up and did what he needed to do, and was a great father to Emma. We always hoped that Andy would find just happiness again, just genuine happiness. He met Stephanie at a school carnival. Her son was the same age as Andy's daughter, and so they were kind of at the same stage in life. I felt like, they would be a good match for each other. When they were together, you could tell they were enjoying each other's company, and, there was an attraction there, and you could definitely see that as well. Andy would be kind of silly and just very affectionate, it was nice to see Andy happy. Stephanie, her and I, we would go out to lunch occasionally. I always wanted a sister-in-law, to be able to be close to, and I wanted to get to know her. I wanted to be a part of their lives. She was very quiet. She didn't really talk about, her family or about her past, what her background was, or any, personal details about herself. I remember not being completely comfortable to ask her those things because she wasn't sharing those things with me automatically. Her background was definitely a mystery, and it does make you wonder, if there was more to this story than we know. One day, my mom came to me and said, I think Andy got married. And I, of course, was very caught off guard. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, he showed me this piece of paper and it looked like a marriage certificate. And I said, surely not. I said, surely he would have told us. I was a little bit shocked and, obviously hurt by, the fact that he had gone off and gotten married and didn't, tell us before or even after. Those are things you tell your family. And if you're not telling your family those things, there's a reason you're not telling them. It felt wrong. And, it made me wonder whose idea was this. I think there was some manipulation going on. After they had gotten married, you could notice some problems. They would seem to be arguing quite a bit. Stephanie definitely had a temper. I just remember thinking, something's not quite right. Andy didn't really go into a lot of details, but he definitely struggled. Kind of his whole world had been rocked at the point. She was very manipulative. I feel like she did things, to deliberately get a rise out of Andy. Stephanie absolutely knew how to press Andy's buttons. Her behavior definitely felt kind of mind game-ish, for lack of better words, and then so I definitely think that was kind of her lifestyle. There were instances where their arguments got out of control and got physical. There was one instance she threw Andy's belongings off the balcony of their apartment. They lived in a very, busy apartment at this point. So she had to know that other people were going to see it. And she may have very well done it to embarrass him. That's humiliating. When Andy and Stephanie would have arguments, Andy would go over to my mom's house. That was his escape, to get away and kind of remove himself from the situation. Stephanie would follow him, essentially track him down. And Stephanie did show up at the house, banging on the front door. She called him and asked him to come outside. He went outside and she went immediately up to him and kissed him. He was very caught off guard by it and kind of stepped back because this, of course, is in the midst of an argument, and, asked her what that was about. And she said, I just wanted to see if there was anything there. And she said, and there's not. And I just remember thinking, well, that was very odd. It just seemed like she was playing a game. This is not normal. This is not okay. She definitely had that Jekyll and Hyde kind of behavior. She was most definitely trying to manipulate him and assert her dominance. That was definitely the moment that I stopped being friendly with her and stopped reaching out to her. At that point, I didn't know what the future held for their relationship. I never in a million years thought it was going to turn out the way it did.
Oh my God. Andy. Andy. Andy.
I could definitely see Andy trying to have his life appear to be as normal as possible. This is a photograph that Andy had posted on Facebook. It looks like a picture that actually Stephanie took of the two of them, and underneath it there is a comment that Stephanie posted that says, "Oh, who's that hot chick in your car?" Stephanie, it appears, has definitely doctored the photo. She seems to have a filter on her face. The post is all about her. But I also think that was in Andy's nature, to be all about her. Andy responds with, "That's the most beautiful and amazing woman in the world. My partner, my other half, my best friend, my wife, Stephanie Kimbrell." He thinks obviously very highly of her and seems to be very much in love. Thinking about it now, it makes me feel a little bit sick to my stomach. Andy, even if he knew 100% that that relationship was not a good situation, I don't think he ever would have said to us, "You're right." He just tried to be the tough guy police officer.
Andy would not have been the aggressor, in my opinion. Andy was not that type of person. He wasn't the type that would run from anything, but he was also not the person that was trying to provoke anything either. Looking back on it now, there's some signs that we probably missed.
I definitely think it was getting worse. There was a situation where Andy's daughter was on the phone through Snapchat with a friend of hers. And they could see them arguing. The friend could see Stephanie and her behavior. And had even brought up the situation to her mom. The girl was that concerned about what was taking place. If that was happening that night, it was probably happening much more frequently than we heard about or knew about.
In 2018, when I got reassigned, I would see him in passing, and there would be days that he wouldn't be as jovial as normal. There was a change in his demeanor.
We had both moved on to different assignments. I think each of us knew deep inside that we wanted to talk, but we just never went to that level.
Andy was secluding himself from us, and so that was very hard to wrap our minds around. The changes in his personality alone would show you that he was struggling. We never, openly saw him tearful, but you could definitely tell that he was struggling. But it really got to the point where he wasn't spending time with my mom that much. And one day Andy had came over to the house. He had asked me if I could print something out for him. You could tell he was not in the best mood. We were in the living room together, and my son was kind of tugging on his jeans and trying to get his attention. All he had to do was kind of reach down and pick him up and, something. And it didn't happen. I knew something was going on with him because that was not like him to do that, to go from this doting uncle to, somebody that's pretty much ignoring him. And that was really a moment, I guess, it was really a turning point for me to see that. And so very blatantly said, hey, I don't know what is going on with Stephanie or anything else, but, my child deserves to have an uncle that he knows. I'm here to help, but I'm not going to be the person you call when you need something. I want to be a part of your life. I proceeded to say some pretty hurtful things. Some I meant, some I didn't. And our relationship at that point became pretty much non-existent. That was the last conversation I had with him. I would reach out to him periodically just to, to say, hey, I just didn't get a response back. But I remember hearing their arguments became more frequent. The people that lived in the apartment complex reached out to us and told us they saw them arguing in the parking lot. These total strangers are reaching out to us, to tell us these stories. It's one thing to have an argument inside your home, but when you are completely, oblivious to that you're having an argument in the middle of a parking lot with people around, and, I definitely think that shows some sort of escalation, that things are getting out of control. There was one instance where he went to my mom's house and showed her scratches on his neck, where Stephanie had put her hands on his neck. I don't know how they got there, if she was choking him or just had put her hands on him in some form or fashion, but there were visible scratches on his neck that appeared to be, pretty significant. I think most people, including myself, when they hear of a domestic violence situation, you automatically assume it's probably initiated by a male, but things are not always what they seem. My mother was upset. She was obviously very fearful for him. Her words were, please come home. You need to get away from her. She's going to kill you. It wasn't a good situation for Andy or Stephanie or the kids. Anybody involved in it, on all sides, it was not a good situation. And it is heartbreaking to watch. He never came out and said, yes, I know that our relationship is not right.
I think that Andy just didn't know how to, or didn't know where to go to for help.
He was just completely hiding it from everybody. I think that he was good at turning it on when he needed to turn it on, that I'm fine, I'm good, just let me go to work.
But knowing Andy and the type of person he was, he wanted to fix it. We were frustrated watching it all fold out and wanting to just take him and, and shake him and say, listen to us, please do something.
Turn to 911.
Oh my God. I need help really bad.
Yeah, calm down.
I am freaking out. Please come and help.
What's going on?
My husband and I were having a disagreement. He put his gun in my hand and it just went off. I'm telling you, I had no idea that was loaded.
You shot your husband, ma'am?
Yes.
Is he responsive right now, ma'am?
I see gurgling, but no. Oh my God. Oh my God. Andy.
About 11:15, I received a phone call from our deputy chief of police, and he said, Andy Kimbrell's been shot. And I was like, where's he at? And he said, he's on his way to UAB. Andy was still alive, and I said, I'm headed to the hospital.
We were asleep in bed, and I got a call, one of the captains from Vestavia Police Department, and his words, I will probably never forget them, were, Andy's been shot, and it doesn't look good. I remember just panic, just absolutely panic, and just not knowing what to do. I didn't know. I mean, I assumed it happened at work, you know, but I didn't know, how do I tell my mom this? What do I say? What's next? I didn't know what to do.
They brought him down to the hospital. So I walked into the emergency room. I met with the nurse and met with the doctor. They let me in the room where they were working on him. And, I just remember walking in and seeing Andy laying there, and his head was bandaged up, and I could see one of his eyes. But I just remember looking at him and going, wake up. And that's when I found out that he had been shot in the head. They had him on a ventilator, and they said, we're trying to track his brain activity. And everybody was frantically trying to do anything they could for him. And so I remember asking the doctor, if he's shot in the head, is he going to make it?
When I first got the call, my sergeant called me and told me that there had been a shooting at an apartment in Garndale. When I arrived on the scene, I entered the master bedroom. The walk-in closet is to your left, and about middle ways down the wall, there's a door leading into the bathroom. There was a bloody handprint on the toilet. Inside the closet, I could definitely see blood splatter. On one side of the wall, there was a large pool of blood in the corner. At first glance at the blood splatter, I could tell that it was not a long-range shot, that it was fairly close. The gun was a 9mm Glock, fairly standard issue for law enforcement. A shell casing was right outside the door of the closet on the floor of the bedroom. Whoever fired the shot was standing in the doorway of the closet or very close to the doorway of the closet. After leaving the scene, we returned to the police department. Stephanie had been placed in the interview room. We just kind of introduced ourselves, and she agreed to speak to us.
When we have a disagreement, we can't just talk. Andy can't talk. He gets really upset. He's a high-stress, high-anxiety person. So I can't talk to him because he immediately is mad, and then he storms off. And then he comes back, and then he storms, that's just how things go.
What was that argument? What was that particular time? What was the argument?
The whole thing. 90% of him being mad all last night was that trainer. I said, okay, I'm not doing anything wrong. You have nothing to worry about. Mm-hmm. Just reasonable, rational conversation. I've never been unfaithful to you. I don't so much as look at other men. You don't want to hear none of it. Lies, lies, lies. BS, BS, BS.
Stephanie told us that he'd accused her in the past of being unfaithful. So according to Stephanie, this argument wasn't out of the blue. She was basically painting a picture of her being just an extremely calm, non-combative, non-argumentative person.
I don't know, we were just scuffling and...
Did he hit you or grab you?
No, nobody hit.
Is he holding you against the wall or what?
He just grabbed me and I was
Standing there holding you like this?
in front of the closet and he spun around and went and got the gun and pulled it out of the holster and shoved it at like my hand.
How did he hand it to you, you remember?
He just shoved it. Like, his hands weren't even off it.
Did you say anything to him?
It happened so fast. And it was just, and pow. I don't even think, I don't even know. I don't know.
I've been in law enforcement for over 24 years. I've never seen a gun just go off. On a Glock, the safety is actually on the trigger. So in order to disengage the safety, you have to pull the trigger. So, it was obvious that the trigger was pulled.
When he tried to give you the gun and put it in your chest, why didn't you just walk away then? I mean, you had a way to get out of there. All you had to do is like, hey, and turn around. But you went and grabbed for the gun.
No, I didn't reach for it and grab for it. That's not what happened.
I mean, your hand had to be outward, or they would have touched the gun. You see what I'm saying?
I don't know. It just happened so fast.
I know that if someone is trying to shove something at me that I don't want, I'm not going to reach for it. I'm going to back away or I'm going to put my hands up. I'm not going to grab it. The longer she talked, the more question marks and red flags kept popping up.
Under her story, they were both standing up, and Andy had the gun in his hands, and he shoves it into her hands when the gun went off. But the fatal wound, the only wound on Andy, was a bullet strike to his forehead, just above the hairline.
We're trying to figure out why the wound, entry wound, would be on the top of his head. Was he kneeling down?
Bent towards me.
I don't think he can really be bent over far enough to where the round hits him in the top of the head.
It just wasn't possible for a gun to go off at waist level and the entry wound be basically on the top of the head. It just didn't make sense.
Can we find out about him?
Yeah, I mean, he's at the hospital when the doctors are taking care of him, so.
When we got to the hospital, one of the pastors that the police department uses was there. I don't even remember what he said, but made mention of the coroner. And that's the moment that we learned he had died. And that's the moment that I learned that Stephanie had shot him. I just remember being in shock. This has to be an accident. This has to be, what could have happened? Did she realize what she was doing? Did she, was it an accident? Was it, I never, and even to this day, it's hard to wrap my mind that she possibly could have a gun in her hand and fire it at him. It's hard to make sense of that.
I just got off the phone with the doctors, and I'm sorry to tell you this, but he's passed away.
mainly kind of wanted to just gauge her reaction. And so, in the interview, you can see me just kind of laser focused on her, really. She sounded upset, but when she raised her head up, she wasn't crying.
And they're in the moment of, letting family members know and stuff like that. So kind of going from there.
I looked directly into her eyes, and they were dry as a bone. There was no tears in her eyes whatsoever. What really happened was really going on here. What Stephanie didn't know was down the hall, we had several witnesses that were present in the house that night.
I'm Detective Cannell from the police department, and you are Emma.
When I was told that, it changed everything. Down the hall, we had Stephanie's son and Andy's daughter.
I'm Detective Cannell from the police department, and you are Emma.
Andy's daughter begins to talk, and she kind of just starts describing what she's been through, and again, the loss of her mom at a young age, and now the loss of her father. It was very tough not to get emotional interviewing her.
How long after they got together did they start this argument?
When they were dating, they would argue a lot, so I didn't think they would last long because they kept on arguing.
Mm-hmm. So they've been kind of bickering and fighting from the beginning.
Yeah.
During the arguments, who seemed to be the more aggressive?
She seemed more aggressive.
She did.
My dad screams, but she's more because I know she's hit him maybe once. And I remember him saying she put him against the wall with it on his neck like that.
According to what we were told, Stephanie was the physical abuser in the relationship. She was the verbal abuser in the relationship. That painted quite a different picture than what Stephanie was telling us. At one point in the evening, she had received a text from Andy saying, lock your doors, she's crazy.
Around 8, I texted. He told me to keep my door locked or something because she was screaming.
Stephanie's son advised us that he was asleep the entire time and he didn't hear anything.
When you went to sleep, did you go to sleep? You just kind of lay there, or what happened? You did go to sleep? Okay. So you didn't hear, okay, all right. So after you went to sleep, you wouldn't woke up by arguing or yelling or any loud noises or anything like that? Nothing like that? You pretty sound asleep there?
Andy's daughter, she was a very important witness because not only was she directly across the hallway from the incident, she was awake the entire time.
I feel it was 10:30, something close to 11, and I heard her say something give me your gun or something. I'm gonna shoot.
When you were down there waiting on it, you and your sister talked, right? Y'all were talking. What was said? Remember?
I'm not sure what happened. And she said that she asked for his gun, and she said, "Fine, here it is." And they shoved it in her hand, and she knew it was loaded and something about fired. Yeah. And he said, okay, and then gave it to her. I stayed because I heard that, and then it went off, and I just heard it pop.
When Andy's daughter made the comment to us, it changed everything. I know in my mind, this just changed from an accident to a possible murder. We went back down the hall and spoke with Stephanie again, and we confronted her with that detail.
He said something to the effect of, if you think I'm so bad, then shoot me.
Oh, yeah, he talks to me like that all the time.
And then you replied, well, then give me your gun.
No,
So you,
I have never asked for that gun.
okay, so if, let's hypothetically say if your kids said that they heard that, they would be lying.
Lying? No, they didn't hear what they think they heard.
See, what you don't understand is they're in 2 bedrooms with the door shut, and y'all are loud enough, but they just didn't make this up.
And they did say that.
And they did say that.
I don't know what to tell you.
Her credibility in my eyes was over. It was done.
In the mugshot, she's clearly injured. Defense attorneys and certainly members of the public, they get to see the mugshot, has some suspicions as to how she got her injuries and been blaming the victim, Andy.
Like this comment here in the picture, you can tell she's been hit. She doesn't deserve to be in jail if she was defending herself.
It's extremely hard to read these comments, just absolutely heartbreaking. The first post says, probably beat her many times before and got away with it. More than likely, she was tired of the abuse. Andy was never abusive to her. You want to scream it from the rooftops, but there's some people that are gonna, question the situation, and especially after seeing her booking photo.
This is a video that was taken from the jail surveillance footage that shows Stephanie Keller while she is in custody and handcuffed. This was taken a few hours before her mugshot. The video itself was interesting, to say the least. And she essentially takes a step towards the vending machine. She nails the vending machine with her face. It would seem to be a very intentional act.
It's very difficult to not be able to reach out to these people that are saying these horrible things, and tell them, you're wrong, this is not how this is. This is a very different situation. It went away very quickly. It's hard to think that somebody that I let in my life and had a relationship with.
And it's 20 years in the penitentiary for Stephanie Keller, and that was the maximum under provocation manslaughter.
I think that the sentence that she received was, no matter what it is.
As a police officer, we're usually the ones that say, hey, here's how you handle this situation. And when we can't do that for ourselves, we question ourselves as to whether we're a failure. And so we have to reach out for help, just like everybody's reaching out for us to help.
Losing Andy had a very much an emotional impact on the department. Every member of the police department was at the funeral.
People came from everywhere, and they just heard about it and wanted to come and show their respect. It makes you so proud to be driving down the road and seeing flags that are, for him. It was definitely a moment to be proud of him. I mean, I will always be proud of him. He was a really great person and a great father. I wanted to remember all the good things that he did as a police officer. Honestly, if I could say anything to her, I would ask her why. I think she's a horrible person. I think she I don't even know if I should say this, but I think this could happen again, given the opportunity.
The call came in just after midnight, the kind of call dispatchers remember forever. The kind that freezes a room even before the address is fully spoken. A woman's voice breaking through static, words tumbling over each other, screaming about a door left open, about silence that felt wrong, about a house that should have been breathing but wasn't. And when patrol cars rolled into the quiet California suburb that night in 1998, their headlights cutting across trimmed lawns and sleeping driveways, no one yet knew they were driving straight into a cold case that would outlive careers, marriages, entire lives. Inside the house, the air was thick, not with the smell of violence at first, but with something colder, something emptier, the uncanny stillness investigators learned to fear, furniture untouched, lights left on as if the evening had simply paused mid-motion, a coffee mug cooling on the kitchen counter, keys still hanging by the door, and upstairs, behind a half-closed bedroom door, the absence became a presence loud and undeniable, because the person who should have been there was gone, and there were no signs explaining how or why. Her name would soon dominate local headlines, then fade into archived clippings, then resurface years later with the word cold case stamped across it like a verdict. But that first night she was just a woman who hadn't come home to herself. A routine life abruptly punctured. A disappearance so clean it felt staged, so quiet it felt intentional. And as detectives moved through the house with gloved hands and narrowed eyes, every detail seemed to whisper the same unsettling message. Whatever happened here did not want to be seen. Neighbors gathered behind yellow tape, some wrapped in blankets, some pretending not to stare, all of them replaying the same questions in their heads. When was the last time anyone saw her? Did they hear anything unusual? Did they notice a strange car? A raised voice? A door slamming? But the street offered nothing, no screams, no shattered glass, no frantic footprints in the soil, just a calm suburban night that refused to confess. By sunrise, the media had arrived, cameras angled just right to capture the house in soft morning light, reporters practicing phrases like mysterious disappearance and shocked community, while detectives inside were already feeling the first, quiet panic of a case slipping through their fingers, because there was no blood, no weapon, no forced entry, and the longer they looked, the more it felt like the scene had been wiped of intent, scrubbed of motive, leaving behind only questions, stacked on top of more questions. Her family arrived next, eyes hollow, voices trembling, offering timelines that felt painfully ordinary, work, errands, plans for the weekend, nothing that screamed danger, nothing that explained why a woman could vanish from her own bedroom without waking the house. And when investigators asked the hardest question, the one they never want the answer to, who would want to hurt her, the silence that followed was heavy, because no one could think of a single name. Days passed, then weeks, and the case ballooned outward, search parties combing nearby fields, helicopters tracing grids over dry hills, divers checking murky water that held nothing but silt and dead leaves, and every effort returned empty-handed, each failure carving the same message deeper into the investigation. This was not a crime of chaos, this was a crime of control. Detectives turned inward, focusing on the house again, replaying that night frame by frame, cataloging the smallest anomalies, a window unlocked that was always locked, a light left on that was usually turned off, fibers on the carpet that didn't belong, details that meant nothing on their own but together formed a pattern just out of reach. And when lab results came back inconclusive, when fingerprints failed to match anyone in the system, frustration hardened into something darker, the quiet dread that they were losing time they would never get back. The press began to drift away, chasing fresher tragedies, but the community did not forget, not really, because fear has a way of lingering, and parents started double-checking doors, routines shifted, conversations lowered at night, and somewhere beneath it all the unspoken understanding settled in. If this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. Months turned into a year, then another, leads dried up, witnesses moved away, memories blurred, and the file grew thicker even as progress stalled. The case officially reclassified, the word cold applied like a medical diagnosis, signaling not the absence of life, but the absence of answers, and for the detectives who stayed with it, the case became a quiet companion, a name they couldn't forget, a scene they replayed in their heads during long drives home. And yet, buried in evidence boxes and forgotten reports, Something remained, something small, something overlooked. A trace collected almost as an afterthought in 1998, preserved without promise, waiting for a future that no one could yet imagine. Because sometimes, the truth doesn't disappear. It just learns how to hide. And as this California cold case slipped deeper into silence, the real story was only beginning to breathe. Years passed the way they always do in unsolved cases, quietly, cruelly, stealing sharp edges from memories while leaving the pain intact. And by the early 2000s the house had new owners, fresh paint, different furniture, but for detectives the layout never changed. The staircase still creaked in the same place, the bedroom still sat at the end of the hall like a sealed confession, and every time the file was reopened, it began there, with that night, with the absence that refused to explain itself. The investigation had never officially stopped, it had simply slowed, reduced to periodic reviews and late-night theorizing, the kind done alone under fluorescent lights. And when new detectives inherited the case, they inherited the same impossible question. How does someone vanish without friction, without noise, without a single mistake left behind? They went back to the people, to the witnesses who had once stood behind police tape with wide eyes and folded arms, now older, more guarded, their stories worn smooth by repetition. And subtle changes emerged, not enough to call lies, but enough to suggest erosion. Times shifted, details softened, the human mind protecting itself from the weight of unsolved horror. And in those softened recollections, detectives sensed something slipping away again. One neighbor mentioned a car, maybe dark-colored, maybe parked a little too long. Another recalled a light flicking on in the early hours, something they'd dismissed at the time. And these fragments were pinned to boards, mapped against timelines, interrogated for meaning, but nothing locked into place, nothing formed a shape solid enough to accuse. Attention turned, as it often does, inward to the victim's life, her routines, her relationships, the small fractures that don't make headlines but sometimes explode in private. Co-workers were interviewed, ex-partners revisited, casual acquaintances elevated to potential suspects by sheer proximity, and every conversation ended the same way, with uncertainty, with alibis that were thin but not broken, with behavior that was strange but not criminal. Then came the theories, whispered at first, then debated openly. Was it someone she knew, someone who understood her schedule, her habits, the layout of her home? Or was it a stranger, bold enough to enter a quiet neighborhood, skilled enough to leave no trace? And each theory had its own gravity, pulling evidence toward it, distorting perspective, creating blind spots investigators didn't yet realize they had. The media returned briefly when a similar disappearance occurred 2 counties away, commentators linking cases with the confidence of distance. But detectives saw differences immediately, too many differences, and the comparison dissolved, leaving behind only the reminder that California was vast, and darkness did not need patterns to thrive. As the years stacked higher, technology advanced, and with it, hope. Old evidence was retested, fingerprints scanned through expanded databases, fibers re-examined with better tools, and once again, the results came back hollow, close enough to tease, too vague to convict, progress measured in millimeters instead of miles. One piece of evidence, however, refused to fade, a biological trace collected from the scene, minute degraded, barely worth cataloging at the time, but preserved anyway, sealed in plastic and optimism. And it sat there dormant, as lab capabilities leapt forward, as headlines began to include phrases like DNA breakthrough and decades-old cold case solved, and detectives wondered, quietly, painfully, would this be one of them? The family never stopped waiting. Even as waiting reshaped them, birthdays passed without candles, holidays without chairs filled. Hope thinned into ritual, checking the phone, opening the door a little slower than everyone else, because some part of them believed that silence could still break, that the past might yet knock. Private investigators dipped in and out of the case, chasing angles law enforcement couldn't justify. Psychics made claims that led nowhere. Tips flooded in after anniversary segments aired on late-night news, each call logged, each promise weighed, most collapsing under the simplest scrutiny. But every now and then, one would linger, a name resurfacing, a rumor refusing to die. One such name belonged to a man who had brushed the edges of the case early on, interviewed, dismissed, forgotten. Not because he was cleared, but because there was nothing solid enough to hold him, no witness willing to point, no evidence brave enough to speak. And his life moved on, quietly, while the file bearing her name grew heavier. Detectives debated reopening that line, some arguing it was a distraction, others sensing unfinished business. And when they finally pulled the old interview tapes from storage, the room fell silent, his voice calm, cooperative, almost rehearsed, answers smooth, too smooth, and the pauses between questions felt longer now, weighted with hindsight. They compared his statements to the timeline again, looking not for contradictions but for opportunities, for moments where the truth could slip through unnoticed. And still, nothing cracked, no smoking gun, no confession hiding between syllables, just a man who had once stood close to a mystery and then stepped away. Outside the department, the case became legend, a story traded between rookies, a cautionary tale about patience and obsession, about how certainty is a luxury investigators rarely afford. And somewhere in that legend, the original human story began to blur, replaced by the idea of the case itself, an unsolved thing, a puzzle instead of a life. Then, quietly, without ceremony, a new request was filed, a last-ditch effort dressed in paperwork, the biological trace sent once more to the lab, now armed with methods that didn't exist in 1998, techniques designed to coax truth from fragments. And when the results came back, they didn't arrive with sirens or celebration, just a report, numbers, probabilities, a match that was not a match, a profile that pointed without naming. It was enough to reopen wounds, enough to stir dormant urgency, but not enough to arrest, not enough to stand in court and say this is the person who took her. And so the case hovered again in that familiar limbo, closer than before, still unreachable. And as detectives stared at the data, one thought cut through the noise with chilling clarity. Someone out there knew exactly what had happened, and they had been living with that knowledge for years. The California night that swallowed her had never given her back, and as this cold case edged toward what looked like progress, it carried with it the same warning it always had: that answers do not arrive cleanly, that truth does not announce itself, and that some mysteries resist closure not because they are unsolvable, but because the moment to solve them was allowed to slip quietly into the dark. The data sat on the desk like a provocation, rows of numbers and probabilities that refused to resolve into a face. And yet for the detectives who had lived with this case for years, it was the loudest thing they had heard since 1998, because for the first time, the silence had texture, a shape they could almost trace, and that was dangerous, because hope in a cold case is never gentle. It sharpens obsession, it pushes people to see patterns where none exist, and miss the ones that do. They began rebuilding the timeline again, not from the night she vanished, but from the weeks leading up to it, combing through phone records that now felt ancient, bank statements printed on fading paper, calendars filled with mundane notes that suddenly looked like coded warnings, lunch plans, errands, a dentist appointment canceled at the last minute, small deviations that, in hindsight, felt heavy with intent. One call stood out, brief, unremarkable on its face, a local number dialed late in the evening, unanswered, no voicemail left, and yet it gnawed at the edges of the investigation, because no one could explain why it happened or why it hadn't happened before. And when detectives tracked the number, it led them not to a stranger, but back into the orbit of familiarity, to someone who knew her well enough to call without hesitation. Someone who would not have raised alarm simply by reaching out. They re-interviewed him, years older now, hair thinning, posture guarded, a life constructed brick by brick on top of the past, and the room felt different this time, not accusatory, not friendly, just heavy, the kind of atmosphere where every word carries weight. And as questions came, his answers echoed the old tapes almost perfectly, the same phrases, the same cadence as if memorized, and that consistency, instead of reassuring, felt rehearsed. Detectives asked about the call, watched his eyes flicker for a fraction of a second too long, watched him dismiss it as nothing, a misdial, a forgotten impulse. And while there was no proof in that moment, something shifted, a subtle recalibration of suspicion, because people forget details, they don't forget scripts, and the gap between memory and performance widened just enough to notice. Meanwhile, the lab pushed further, stretching the limits of the degraded DNA, building a partial profile that could not identify a person outright, but could narrow a universe, male, approximate age range, ancestral markers that pointed away from millions and toward thousands. And when those results came in, they aligned uncomfortably well with the man now back under scrutiny, close enough to unsettle, far enough to deny certainty. The department debated next steps, caution versus momentum, because without a full match, without a confession, any move risked collapse, and yet doing nothing felt worse, like watching a door slowly close. So they did what cold case units do best. They waited, they watched, they quietly gathered, tracking movements, revisiting old acquaintances, mapping connections that had once seemed irrelevant. Whispers surfaced, old rumors resurrected from the edges of memory, a disagreement that had turned heated, a fixation that had been dismissed as harmless at the time, behaviors reinterpreted through the harsh lens of what came after. And while none of it qualified as evidence, together it painted a picture that was deeply unsettling, not of a monster lurking in shadows, but of something far more disturbing, a person capable of blending in perfectly. The community felt it too, though they couldn't articulate why. Anniversary coverage reignited interest, social media threads speculated freely, names floated without consequence, and fear crept back into conversations that had long since moved on. Because unsolved cases do not stay buried, they resurface when conditions are right, when a spark finds old fuel. Then, unexpectedly, a new voice entered the narrative, a former acquaintance who had never spoken to police before, someone who claimed to have overheard a conversation years ago. Something casual, something unsettling, a joke made at the wrong time, a comment that landed differently after the disappearance. And while memory is a fragile thing, detectives listened carefully, because cold cases survive on the willingness to hear even the faintest echoes. Her statement didn't solve anything, but it shifted perspective, reframing old interactions, casting long shadows over moments once considered benign. And when detectives cross-referenced her account with travel records and work schedules from the time, a narrow window appeared, a sliver of opportunity that matched the night perfectly, too perfectly to ignore. Pressure mounted, internally and externally, and the man at the center of this tightening circle felt it. His demeanor changing, cooperation giving way to defensiveness, his lawyer suddenly present in conversations that once felt informal. And that alone spoke volumes, because innocence often leans into clarity, while guilt, if it exists, seeks shelter. Still, nothing broke, no confession, no decisive evidence, and the DNA remained stubbornly partial, a promise without fulfillment. And as months passed in this renewed phase of the investigation, the case teetered again on the brink of stagnation, the familiar cliff edge where effort meets limitation. What no one realized then was that the most dangerous element had yet to surface, not a new suspect, not a new technology, but time itself, because time does not just erode memories, it changes people, loosens tongues, rearranges priorities, and somewhere out there, someone was growing tired of carrying a secret that had begun to feel heavier with each passing year. The California cold case was no longer sleeping. It was restless, shifting, pressing back against the boundaries that had contained it for decades. And as investigators sensed momentum building towards something irreversible, one truth became impossible to ignore. When a mystery starts to move again, it rarely does so quietly. And whatever came next would not simply answer questions. It would shatter the fragile equilibrium that had held for far too long. Momentum is a dangerous thing in an old investigation, because once it starts moving, it pulls everything with it, doubts, egos, fear, and in this case, a past that had been allowed to stay quiet for far too long. And as detectives leaned into that momentum, they felt the ground shift beneath them. The subtle realization that they were no longer chasing a ghost, they were circling something solid, something that could feel them coming. The man at the center of the renewed scrutiny began to change his patterns, not dramatically, not in ways that would trip alarms, but enough to register to trained eyes. Routes altered, routines tightened, conversations cut short, and these micro-adjustments spoke a language detectives understood well. The language of someone recalculating risk, someone suddenly aware that the past might not stay buried. They pulled financial records again, this time with fresh intent. Not just looking for anomalies but for silence, for stretches where activity vanished, where cash replaced cards, where movement stopped being documented, and there it was, a narrow corridor of time around the disappearance where transactions thinned unnaturally. A gap that did not prove guilt but suggested caution, the kind of caution learned the hard way. Investigators reached out to people who had drifted to the periphery of his life, former co-workers, old friends, neighbors from addresses he no longer occupied. and the responses followed a familiar pattern: surprise, disbelief, reluctance, then hesitation, because no one wants to believe they stood close to something terrible without seeing it. And yet, when pressed gently, details emerged: mood swings, unexplained absences, a temper that surfaced without warning, traits that once seemed merely human now felt edged with something sharper. One conversation, however, cut deeper than the rest, a former confidant recalling a night heavy with alcohol and bravado. A story told half as a joke, half as a confession, about how easy it would be to make someone disappear if you really wanted to, how the world forgets faster than it admits, and at the time, it had been laughed off, dismissed as dark humor, but now retold under fluorescent lights, it landed like a warning fired too late. Detectives didn't react outwardly, they knew better. They logged the statement, verified dates, cross-checked locations, and quietly, methodically, the walls began to inch closer, not enough to corner him, but enough to let him feel the pressure, enough to make sleep harder, conversations shorter. And when they called him in again, the atmosphere was no longer neutral, it was heavy with implication. He denied everything, again firmly, consistently, his lawyer seated close, eyes alert, interrupting when questions drifted too far toward conjecture. And yet beneath the polished refusals, tension crackled, his foot tapping, his hands tightening. The subtle tells that don't convict but do not reassure. And when detectives mentioned the DNA, carefully, deliberately vague, his reaction was immediate, a stiffening that rippled through him before he masked it behind practiced calm. Outside the interview room, debate flared, some arguing they were reading too much into behavior, others convinced they were watching a man realize the math was no longer in his favor. And this division was dangerous, because cold cases often fracture teams, turning intuition into fault lines. And yet, despite disagreements, one thing was clear: the investigation could not retreat again, not now. The lab delivered another update, incremental, frustrating, hopeful. The partial DNA profile refined further, still incomplete, but now strong enough to exclude several lingering possibilities, narrowing the field, tightening the circle. And when those exclusions crossed names off the board, the gravity shifted almost entirely onto the man they had been watching, not by assumption, but by elimination, the cold logic that defines long-delayed justice. Media interest reignited sharply, headlines flirting with certainty they could not yet claim, phrases like breakthrough and new suspect splashed across screens, and with that attention came risk, because publicity hardens defenses. It alerts those who might otherwise slip. And detectives worried they were being forced toward a premature climax, a confrontation without a net. The family felt the whiplash most acutely, hope surging back into lives long conditioned against it. Interviews requested, statements prepared, emotions scraped raw by the possibility that answers might finally be close. And yet even they sensed the fragility of the moment, the understanding that progress in a cold case can vanish as quickly as it appears. Then came the tip that changed the temperature of the room entirely. A late-night call from someone who refused to give their name at first, voice low, controlled, claiming knowledge not available to the public, details about the house, about that night, about a sound that hadn't been reported, a mistake that hadn't been noticed, and as detectives listened, pens stilled, because this was not rumor, this was specificity. The caller eventually identified themselves, a former associate of the man under scrutiny. Someone who had fallen out of his orbit years earlier, carrying resentment and fear in equal measure. And they described a conversation from long ago, not overheard, not inferred, but told directly, a fragmented admission framed as a hypothetical. A what-if that was too precise to be fiction, too rehearsed to be spontaneous. Investigators moved quickly, corroborating what they could without tipping their hand, verifying that the details shared had never been released. And when that confirmation came back positive, the case took on a new weight, no longer theoretical, no longer circumstantial, but still maddeningly incomplete, because hearsay, no matter how compelling, does not put handcuffs on wrists. They prepared for the next step carefully, aware that this might be the last clean shot they had. Surveillance tightened, movements logged, and when they finally requested another interview, it was framed as routine, procedural, nothing alarming, but inside, everyone knew this was different. This was the moment where truth sometimes cracks, where fatigue outweighs caution. In the room, the questions circled tighter, revisiting old ground with new angles, testing reactions rather than answers. And when detectives introduced the existence of a witness who knew things he shouldn't, his composure faltered noticeably, anger flashing where denial had lived before, accusations flying, claims of betrayal, and that emotional shift was telling, because it suggested recognition, not confusion. Still, when the interview ended, he walked out a free man, no arrest, no charges, just a promise of continued contact. And as the door closed behind him, frustration rippled through the team, the bitter taste of being close enough to touch something and still coming up empty-handed. The case had reached a precarious place, balanced between revelation and collapse, and everyone involved felt it. The detectives, the family, the community, because the closer an unsolved story gets to answers, the more violently it resists them. And as night settled over California once more, the same darkness that had swallowed her decades earlier pressed in again, heavy with the sense that the truth was not done fighting. Pressure does not always arrive with sirens and headlines. Sometimes it seeps in slowly, tightening routines, shortening tempers, and after that last interview, pressure became the dominant force in the case, an invisible presence shaping every decision, every conversation, because everyone involved understood the same dangerous truth. If they pushed too hard without enough weight behind them, the case could collapse permanently, but if they eased off now, it might never come back. Surveillance reports stacked up quietly, pages filled with movements that looked ordinary until viewed through the lens of suspicion. Late-night drives with no clear destination, long pauses in parked cars, meetings that seemed unnecessary, and while none of it crossed legal thresholds, it fed a growing narrative of restlessness, a man increasingly uncomfortable in his own patterns, as if the walls were no longer where he remembered them. Investigators returned again to the house, now long separated from the crime by time and new ownership, walking the rooms not for evidence but for understanding, tracing possible paths, testing sightlines, listening to how sound carried at night, and in that stillness, a realization crystallized. The disappearance had required cooperation from the environment. Knowledge of when neighbors slept, when doors were left unsecured, when noise would dissolve into background, and that level of familiarity narrowed the profile even further. The biological evidence, stubborn and fragile, became the focal point once more, analysts pushing its limits, extracting fractions of information from material barely worthy of the name. And then came the development no one wanted to trust, a probabilistic match emerging through genealogical comparison. Not a name, not yet, but a family tree branching outward, pointing toward a cluster of relatives connected by blood and geography. A new path that bypassed traditional databases entirely. The implications were enormous and terrifying, because this method had cracked other cold cases, but it also carried legal and ethical landmines, and as detectives traced distant cousins and ancestral lines, they felt the case shift from pursuit to excavation, digging through decades of shared history to uncover a truth someone had buried deliberately. One branch of that family tree bent unmistakably back toward the man they had been circling. Not directly, not cleanly, but close enough to make the room go quiet, because coincidence had run out of excuses. And when analysts overlaid the genealogical data with timelines, locations, and opportunity, the alignment was no longer uncomfortable, it was damning in its consistency. Still, the law demanded certainty, not alignment, and prosecutors were cautious, reminding investigators that probabilities do not persuade juries, that cold cases are fragile in court, vulnerable to doubt, to accusations of tunnel vision, to the erosion of evidence over time. And so the hunt continued for something tangible, something undeniable. That something almost surfaced in the form of an object. A personal item linked to the victim, rumored to have been seen years earlier in the possession of someone who should not have had it. A rumor dismissed at the time as gossip, but now resurrected with urgency. Detectives tracked the claim through old photos, pawn records, second-hand recollections, chasing the possibility that a relic of that night had survived unnoticed. The search led them to a storage unit rented under a name adjacent to the suspect's orbit. Not his, but close enough to raise pulses. And when a warrant was finally secured, the team approached with the kind of restrained expectation born from too many disappointments. Doors rolling up to reveal dust, boxes, fragments of lives paused and forgotten, and then tucked away, something that made everyone stop breathing for a moment. It was not the smoking gun they hoped for, But it was wrong, out of place, an item that echoed descriptions given years earlier, worn in a way that suggested age rather than coincidence. And while it could not yet be conclusively tied to the victim, its presence raised questions no one could answer comfortably, questions that demanded explanation. The man was confronted with the discovery indirectly, investigators watching for reaction rather than response, and what they saw unsettled them deeply, not confusion, not shock, but anger, immediate and sharp, directed not at the accusation but at the intrusion, as if something private had been violated, something he had believed permanently hidden. Behind closed doors, the team debated strategy again, aware that every move now was irreversible, that once they crossed the line into accusation, there would be no retreat, and in that debate, the weight of the years pressed down hardest because this was no longer just about solving a case, it was about justifying the time, the hope, the suffering invested by everyone left waiting. The family was briefed cautiously, given only what was necessary, and even that was enough to reopen wounds they had spent decades learning to live around. Emotions swinging violently between anticipation and dread, because answers, when they come, rarely bring the peace people imagine. They bring finality, and finality is its own kind of loss. As weeks passed, the suspect's behavior grew more erratic, missed appointments, sudden trips, legal consultations multiplying, and while none of it constituted flight, it painted a portrait of someone preparing, someone recalibrating for an outcome he could sense but not yet see, and that preparation carried a chilling implication. He believed something was coming. The cold case had reached a point of no return, where every new detail carried the potential to tip it into resolution or ruin, and as investigators stood on that edge, staring into the space between suspicion and proof, they understood the cruel paradox at the heart of unsolved crimes, that the closer you get to the truth, the more it demands, and the less margin for error it allows. Somewhere in California, a man was sleeping poorly, waking to thoughts he could no longer silence, and somewhere else, a family was daring, carefully, to imagine an ending to a story that had consumed their lives, while between them, suspended in uncertainty, the case itself waited, poised for the moment when silence would finally fail. Silence became suspicious in a way it hadn't before, not the silence of missing evidence, but the silence of a man who had stopped explaining himself, and detectives noticed it immediately, the shift from defensive talking to strategic quiet, calls returned by attorneys instead of voices, schedules suddenly opaque, movements harder to predict, as if he had learned that words were liabilities and absence was safer. The genealogical thread tightened further, analysts expanding the family map outward and backward, eliminating branches, isolating lines, until the probability sharpened into something dangerously close to specificity, still not a courtroom-ready name, but a statistical gravity pulling relentlessly toward one point. And when prosecutors reviewed the updated report, they didn't dismiss it, they frowned, which in this world meant something entirely different. They authorized deeper digging, the kind that turns up truths no one expects to find, old police contacts from unrelated incidents, minor disputes, noise complaints, moments where his name had brushed law enforcement without consequence, and when those fragments were assembled, a pattern emerged, not of criminality, but of volatility, a history of reactions that escalated quickly, then vanished just as fast, leaving behind apologies and explanations. Detectives revisited the night again, this time not as observers, but as participants, reenacting movements, timing footsteps, opening doors at different speeds, testing how long it would take for a sound to reach a neighbor's window. And what they discovered was unsettling, a narrow window where everything aligned, where a brief struggle could dissolve into silence, where someone familiar could guide another without resistance. And in that reconstruction, the theory stopped feeling theoretical. The suspect was invited to participate in a voluntary DNA collection, framed as routine, procedural, a chance to clear lingering doubts, and the refusal came swiftly, decisively, legal language replacing casual conversation. And while refusal is not guilt, in the context of a cold case revived by DNA, it spoke louder than any denial, because innocence often seeks resolution, while fear avoids confirmation. That refusal became a pivot point, prosecutors reassessing timelines, warrants, thresholds, because a court would need more than suspicion to compel compliance. And so investigators hunted for corroboration. Anything that could link him physically, temporally, emotionally to that night in a way that would survive cross-examination. They found it, not in evidence but in absence, a gap in his alibi that had always been glossed over. A stretch of time accounted for only by his own statement, no witnesses, no receipts, no digital footprint, and when that gap was measured against the reconstructed timeline, it fit too cleanly, like a missing puzzle piece finally placed. The man sensed the shift, paranoia creeping into his public behavior, snapping at colleagues, withdrawing from friendships, and in one telling moment, captured inadvertently by a third party, he was heard muttering about how they never had anything, and how time was supposed to take care of it. A statement ambiguous enough to dismiss, sharp enough to remember. Investigators documented everything, because cold cases teach patience like nothing else. And they knew the most dangerous phase of an investigation is the one where certainty feels close but isn't yet earned. The phase where mistakes are made out of urgency rather than necessity. Another witness came forward, quieter than the last, less dramatic, but potentially more devastating, someone who recalled lending him a vehicle around the time of the disappearance. A detail never mentioned before, forgotten until the resurgence of attention jogged memory loose. And when records confirmed the vehicle had been unaccounted for that night, the room went very still. That vehicle became a focal point, its history traced through years of ownership changes, repairs, cleanings, a life lived after the fact, and though physical evidence was unlikely to survive decades, its movement alone added weight, placing him mobile during a period he had previously described as uneventful. The pressure finally spilled into the open when detectives executed a search warrant on a property tied loosely to his past, not expecting miracles, but understanding that sometimes the most telling discoveries are the ones that explain behavior rather than prove acts. And what they found did exactly that. Items carefully kept, not illegal, not incriminating on their own, but obsessive, reminders preserved with an intensity that felt incompatible with innocence. Psychological consultants reviewed the findings, offering interpretations that danced carefully around diagnoses, emphasizing patterns of control, fixation, compartmentalization, traits consistent with someone capable of maintaining a secret for years while presenting normalcy. And though profiles don't convict, they contextualize, giving investigators a framework that suddenly made the past feel legible. As word spread quietly through the department, the tone changed, skepticism giving way to guarded confidence, not celebration, not certainty, but a shared understanding that the case was no longer drifting, it was converging, and convergence in a cold case is both exhilarating and terrifying. Because it means someone is about to lose the life they've been living. The family was told again, more directly this time, that things were moving, and their reactions were restrained, cautious, shaped by years of disappointment, but beneath that restraint was a current of resolve, a readiness for truth, even if it arrived ugly and incomplete. The suspect, for his part, began making calls of his own legal, personal, strategic, rearranging his world in small, telling ways, and as investigators watched these preparations unfold, one thought settled heavily among them. People don't brace themselves for nothing. The California cold case had entered its most volatile chapter, where evidence, memory, and human behavior collided under mounting pressure, and everyone involved could feel it. The sense that the story was accelerating toward a moment that could no longer be delayed, a moment when silence would either shatter or calcify forever. The first crack didn't come from evidence, it came from exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones after years of holding a story together, and detectives recognized it instantly when the suspect stopped returning messages altogether. Not through lawyers, not through intermediaries, just absence, a vanishing act that echoed the original crime in a way that felt almost intentional. They found him eventually, not hiding, not fleeing, just staying still, anchored to a routine stripped to essentials, work, home, nothing else, and that stillness raised alarms, because people who believe they are safe don't compress their lives this tightly, they sprawl, they relax, they forget, and he was doing the opposite. Prosecutors convened behind closed doors, weighing the accumulated mass of the case, partial DNA, genealogical probability, witness statements, behavioral shifts, alibi gaps, and the ever-present danger of confirmation bias. And the question was no longer whether he was involved, but whether they could prove it without burning the case beyond repair. They decided to apply pressure indirectly, not with accusations, but with exposure, Subpoenas issued to those around him, friends, former partners, colleagues, pulling at the social threads that had insulated him for decades. Because secrets rarely survive isolation, they rely on networks, on people willing to look away. The strategy worked faster than expected. A former partner contacted investigators quietly, reluctantly, carrying a story they had never told anyone. About a night years ago when he came home late, agitated, clothes changed, explanations thin. And when asked about it, he snapped in a way they had never seen before, warning them never to bring it up again. That night had been dismissed at the time as stress, as mood, as something private, but now, aligned with the timeline, it took on a chilling clarity. And when detectives asked why they were coming forward now, the answer was simple: because the name was everywhere again, because the past had stopped staying past. Another acquaintance followed, then another, not with confessions, but with fragments, odd comments, strange silences, moments where his words slipped and then were reeled back in. A pattern of almosts that formed a shape no single story could explain alone, but together painted something unmistakable. The suspect felt it closing in, his demeanor shifting from guarded to hostile, complaints filed, accusations of harassment, claims of a witch hunt fueled by technology and rumor. And while some of that language echoed legitimate concerns, it was delivered with a desperation that rang hollow, because innocence usually argues facts, not fate. Investigators requested one more interview, this time not framed as routine, but as an opportunity, a chance to address the mounting inconsistencies before they hardened into charges. And after days of silence, he agreed, conditions set, lawyer present, cameras rolling, a controlled environment designed to capture not just words but cracks. The interview unfolded slowly, methodically, questions looping back on themselves, timelines revisited from new angles. And at first he held steady, answers clipped, rehearsed. But then the genealogical evidence was introduced, not as accusation, but as reality, the science explained carefully, the narrowing probabilities laid out with calm precision. That was the moment his composure fractured, not dramatically, not explosively, but subtly, his breathing shallow, his eyes darting, the muscle in his jaw tightening as if holding something back. And when asked directly whether he wanted to explain how his genetic profile aligned so closely with evidence from the scene, he didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, heavy, and when he finally spoke, it wasn't denial, it was deflection, a challenge to the process, to the ethics, to the legitimacy of science reaching backward through time. And while his lawyer jumped in quickly, the damage was done, because the question he avoided was louder than any answer he could have given. Outside the room, detectives exchanged looks that needed no translation. They had seen this before. The moment when a suspect realizes the ground rules have changed, when the story they've relied on is no longer sufficient, and that realization has consequences. Within days, prosecutors moved, not with an arrest, but with preparation, drafting arguments, lining up expert witnesses, stress-testing the case against hypothetical juries. And the conclusion was unanimous: risky, fragile, but viable. A case built not on a single revelation, but on convergence, the slow, relentless alignment of truth. The family was informed that charges were being considered, not promised, not announced, just considered, and the news landed like thunder muffled by distance, relief and terror colliding, because an arrest would not undo the years, would not answer every question, but it would end the waiting, and waiting had become its own kind of punishment. The suspect retained additional counsel, his public posture shifting toward defiance, statements issued about innocence and persecution. And yet behind that posture, preparations continued, assets rearranged, goodbyes made quietly, as if he understood that the life he had constructed was nearing its expiration date. The cold case that had once drifted at the edges of memory was now at the center of everything, commanding resources, attention, and resolve. And as investigators pushed toward a decision that would define their careers, they felt the weight of the truth pressing back, because unsolved cases do not yield easily, and when they finally do, they often demand a price. Somewhere between accusation and arrest, between suspicion and proof, the case hovered, vibrating with tension, and everyone involved sensed it. The calm before a confrontation that would either collapse the entire narrative or lock it into history forever. The decision came without ceremony, no dramatic announcement, just a quiet agreement sealed in a conference room where everyone understood the stakes. Move now or risk losing the momentum forever. And when prosecutors finally authorized the arrest, it felt less like victory and more like crossing a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The warrant was executed at dawn, not because it made good television, but because dawn catches people in the space between sleep and defense. And when officers approached his door, the neighborhood looked exactly like it had decades earlier, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of place where nothing bad is supposed to happen, and yet something terrible already had. He answered calmly, almost expectantly, as if he had rehearsed this moment so many times it had lost its power, hands visible, voice steady. And when cuffs closed around his wrists, there was no struggle, no protest, just a faint tightening around the eyes, the expression of someone who knows the long game has ended. News broke fast, headlines splashing the word arrest, next to 1998 cold case. Shock rippling through the community, disbelief colliding with grim validation, because for years this case had lived in the abstract, a mystery without a villain, and now it had a face, a name. A neighbor people realized they had passed on sidewalks and in grocery aisles without knowing what he carried. At the station, the interview was brief, procedural, almost anticlimactic, because arrests are not confessions, and seasoned investigators know better than to expect closure from a man who has already proven his ability to endure silence. And when he declined to speak, it felt less like resistance and more like consistency. Evidence was laid out methodically, not for him, but for the record, the partial DNA, the genealogical pathway, the witnesses, the alibi gaps, each piece fragile alone, formidable together, and while he listened, eyes fixed on a spot just beyond the table, something else became clear. He was no longer surprised by anything they said. The community reacted in waves, some relieved, some skeptical, some angry that it had taken so long, others fearful that an arrest did not guarantee truth, because cold cases teach people not to trust endings easily. And social media filled the gaps with speculation, theories hardening into certainty before courts ever spoke. The family stood before cameras reluctantly, faces lined by years of waiting, voices steady but strained, careful not to say the words they had imagined for so long, because they understood better than anyone that an arrest is not justice. It is only the beginning of a different kind of uncertainty. Behind the scenes, defense attorneys moved aggressively, motions filed challenging the science, the witnesses, the timeline, the very notion that decades-old evidence could be trusted, and prosecutors braced themselves for a battle that would not be fought on facts alone, but on doubt, on the erosion of memory, on the fear of convicting the wrong person after so much time. As pretrial hearings unfolded, the case began to feel less like an investigation and more like an autopsy. Every decision from 1998 dissected, every missed opportunity exposed, and detectives who had given their lives to the case found themselves on the stand, defending choices made under pressure, with limited tools in a different era. The DNA took center stage, experts explaining probability in language juries could grasp, emphasizing convergence rather than certainty, and while the numbers were persuasive, they were not absolute, and that sliver of uncertainty became the defense's sharpest weapon. Then came the witness testimony, stories resurfacing after years of silence, memories strained through time, and as each person spoke, the courtroom held its breath, because these were not perfect narratives, they were human ones, flawed, emotional, vulnerable to attack, and attacked they were. The defendant sat through it all without visible reaction, posture unchanged, eyes forward, as if distance were a shield, and that stillness unsettled observers more than anger would have, because it suggested acceptance, or calculation, or something darker that refused interpretation. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered daily, some seeking closure, others seeking answers that no verdict could provide, and reporters repeated the same phrases: cold case, decades later, breakthrough. Words that felt both accurate and insufficient, because they could not capture the cost of waiting. As the trial approached its critical phase, a tension settled over everyone involved, the sense that this story was nearing an ending, but not necessarily the one people expected, because cold cases do not resolve cleanly, they unravel, leaving loose threads no matter how tightly you pull. And in that space between hope and fear, one question lingered unspoken in every mind connected to the case. If the truth was finally within reach, what would it demand in return, and who would be left standing when it was done? The courtroom grew smaller as the trial wore on, Not physically, but emotionally, the air tightening with every passing day. Because what had once been a mystery now demanded decisions. And decisions carry weight that speculation never does. The prosecution leaned into accumulation, not claiming perfection, but inevitability, walking jurors through decades of silence, through the way fragments ignored in isolation began to lock together when viewed without mercy. And they spoke carefully, aware that overreach would shatter trust faster than doubt ever could. The defense answered with erosion, sanding down every edge, reminding the jury again and again that time is the enemy of truth, that memories rot, that science evolves, and that what looks convincing now might have been impossible to imagine in 1998. A warning framed as reason, skepticism disguised as responsibility. Witnesses returned to the stand, voices trembling under cross-examination, inconsistencies dragged into the light, moments of hesitation seized upon as proof of unreliability. And for each witness who held steady, another faltered, not because they were lying, but because decades had passed and human memory does not survive untouched. The genealogical DNA evidence became the trial's gravitational center, experts explaining how probabilities stack, how exclusion can be as powerful as inclusion, how science does not accuse but narrows until only one path remains, and jurors listened, brows furrowed, grappling with numbers that felt abstract and yet terrifyingly specific. The defense countered hard, questioning consent, privacy, statistical interpretation, raising the specter of wrongful convictions built on new tools applied to old evidence, and the courtroom felt the tremor of a larger cultural debate bleeding into a single man's fate. Outside, protesters gathered, some holding signs demanding justice, others warning against precedent. And the case became more than a disappearance, it became a symbol, a test of whether the past could be judged by the present without distorting either. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the decision on whether the defendant would testify. And when word spread that he would not, reactions split sharply, some seeing guilt in silence, others seeing prudence. And the judge reminded the jury, firmly, that silence was not evidence, though everyone knew how hard that instruction was to obey. Closing arguments arrived like controlled detonations, the prosecution urging jurors to see the full picture, to understand that no single piece carried the truth, but together they formed a narrative too cohesive to ignore, while the defense warned against storytelling, against mistaking coherence for certainty, against filling gaps with belief. As deliberations began, the courtroom emptied into a waiting room of collective anxiety, days stretching long, reporters camped outside, families pacing hallways, detectives replaying testimony in their heads, and somewhere in the county jail, a man waited without expression. The jury's questions came back slowly, requests for transcripts, clarifications on DNA, timelines revisited, and each request was dissected by observers for meaning, hope flaring and fading with every update, because in a case like this, interpretation becomes obsession. When the verdict finally came, the room filled again, breath held in unison, the foreperson's voice steady, words landing one by one, and the reaction was immediate and divided, some gasping, some exhaling, some frozen entirely, because whatever the outcome, it did not feel like an ending. The judge spoke, reminding everyone that verdicts do not resurrect the missing, do not rewind time, do not restore what was taken, and yet they matter, because they draw a line between what society can accept and what it cannot. The family listened, faces unreadable, years of waiting crashing into a single moment that could not possibly contain them. And when they left the courtroom, cameras followed, searching for catharsis that never comes in real life. Appeals were announced almost immediately, promises of continued battle. And the case shifted again, from trial to aftermath, from evidence to interpretation, from facts to legacy, and the question of truth loosened from the verdict, drifting back into uncertainty. Because cold cases, even when they reach court, rarely conclude with finality, they echo, through appeals, through doubt, through unanswered questions that survive conviction or acquittal alike. And as the courthouse doors closed behind the crowd, one thing became painfully clear. The disappearance that began in silence had ended not with resolution, but with a deeper, more complicated quiet, the kind that settles in after noise fades, leaving behind the unsettling realization that knowing what happened is not the same as understanding it. After the verdict, time did what it always does. It moved on without asking permission, dragging the case with it into a new, uncomfortable phase where nothing felt resolved and everything felt permanent, because a decision had been made, but certainty had not been earned. Appeals paperwork piled up quietly, arguments sharpened, experts re-engaged, and the story began to fracture again, not into evidence and counter-evidence, but into belief and disbelief, lines drawn not by facts alone, but by how much doubt people were willing to tolerate. The community split along those lines, conversations stiffening, names lowered to whispers again, because an arrest had promised clarity and delivered ambiguity, and ambiguity is harder to live with than mystery. It forces people to choose a version of the truth and defend it. The house where it began remained occupied, ordinary, lights turning on and off like any other home. And yet people still slowed when they passed it, still glanced at the windows, because places remember things even when people try not to, and memory clings to geography in ways evidence never can. Detectives returned to their desks, the case file officially marked with outcomes and dates, but unofficially still alive, still referenced in quiet conversations, still reopened in the mind during sleepless nights, because a career spent chasing one story does not simply stop when the system says it should. Some investigators believed deeply that justice had finally been served, that convergence was as close to truth as the world ever allows, while others carried a gnawing uncertainty, the fear that a gap remained, that something essential had slipped past unnoticed decades ago, and could never be recovered now. The family tried to build a life after waiting, a task far harder than anyone imagines, because grief shaped by uncertainty does not end. It changes form, and whether the verdict confirmed their worst fears or failed to meet them, the absence at the center of their lives remained unchanged. Media interest waned again, headlines giving way to newer tragedies, the phrase cold case sliding back into archives, but online the story persisted, dissected by strangers, timelines rebuilt by people with no stake except curiosity, certainty claimed by those who had never felt the cost of being wrong. New theories emerged, alternative suspects proposed, details elevated beyond their weight, and the case became a canvas onto which unresolved anxieties were projected, about science, about justice, about whether the past should ever be disturbed if it cannot be perfectly explained. Occasionally, a new tip arrived, thin and hopeful, forwarded dutifully, reviewed carefully, dismissed reluctantly, because reopening anything now risked unraveling what little coherence had been achieved. And yet ignoring new information felt like betrayal. The defendant lived in a strange limbo, defined by the case regardless of outcome, his name permanently fused to a disappearance, his life reduced to footnotes and arguments, because in the public imagination, guilt and innocence are rarely separated cleanly once a story has been told loudly enough. Experts continued to debate the DNA, refining interpretations, publishing papers, using the case as reference without naming it, and in those debates, the evidence shifted subtly over time, not changing what it was, but changing how confidently people spoke about it. Every anniversary brought renewed attention, brief spikes of interest followed by quiet retreat, and with each passing year, the original night receded further into abstraction, details dissolving into narrative, the line between what was known and what was assumed growing thinner. And yet, something remained unresolved in a way no verdict could touch, a fundamental question that had never been answered, not in court, not in evidence, not in testimony. What actually happened in those unseen minutes when a woman vanished without sound, without witness, without resistance? That question lingered like static, faint but persistent, because even if responsibility had been assigned, the mechanics of the act, the motive, the precise sequence of choices that led to disappearance, remained locked in a mind that had never opened. The cold case had transformed, not into a solved story, but into a cautionary one, about patience, about limits, about the difference between legal truth and lived truth. And as years continued to layer over it, the case settled into something heavier than mystery. It became an absence with a name, a story with an ending that refused to feel like one, and in that refusal lay its final power. The reminder that some crimes do not end when the court adjourns, they end only when every question is answered, and some questions never are. In the end, the case did not fade out, it dimmed, slowly, unevenly, like a light left on in an empty room, because stories like this do not conclude, they linger, embedding themselves into the spaces between official records and private memory, where no ruling can reach them. Years after the trial, people still spoke her name cautiously, as if saying it too loudly might disturb something that had finally gone quiet. And yet quiet was never what the case became. It was something closer to a low, constant hum, present beneath daily life, audible only if you listened for it. The evidence was boxed, labeled, archived, sealed with the confidence of procedure, but even sealed things breathe, and occasionally, someone would request access, a journalist revisiting old notes, a researcher studying genealogical methods, a new detective assigned to cold cases who wanted to understand how convergence could feel so convincing and yet remain incomplete. Those detectives walked the same path their predecessors had, leafing through transcripts, staring at photographs taken before everything went wrong, absorbing the same uncomfortable realization that the most important moments of the crime were the ones no one ever saw, the choices made in private, the seconds where intent crystallized into action. The family learned to live alongside a version of closure that did not close anything, anniversaries marked not by ceremonies, but by silence, because grief, after so long, stops demanding attention and starts demanding accommodation, reshaping routines, expectations, futures. They stopped waiting for answers and started carrying questions instead, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, because unanswered questions can be set down occasionally, while answers, once given, must be lived with forever. The man at the center of the case aged, visibly, time asserting itself regardless of outcome. And whether he spoke about the past or not became irrelevant, because the story had already detached from him, taking on a life of its own, circulating independently, interpreted and reinterpreted by people who would never meet him. The house changed hands again, renovations erasing traces that no longer existed, walls repainted, floors replaced, and yet something persisted there too. Not in structure, but in narrative, the knowledge that a place can be ordinary and haunted at the same time, not by ghosts, but by unanswered sequences of human choice. Occasionally, a new technological advance sparked speculation. Could this finally resolve it? Could this extract certainty from fragments that had resisted it for decades? And experts answered carefully, because certainty is not something science promises, only probability refined over time. And probability, no matter how compelling, does not replay a night, does not reconstruct the exact sound of a door opening, the precise moment fear turned into compliance, the decision that transformed a routine evening into a disappearance. The cold case became a reference point, cited in training, debated in classrooms, held up as proof of persistence or caution depending on who told the story. And in that retelling, the edges softened again, not out of neglect, but out of inevitability, because memory is not static, it evolves with the needs of the present. Still, somewhere beneath all interpretations, one truth remained immovable: a woman had vanished, and nothing that followed, no arrest, no trial, no verdict, returned what was taken. And that absence was the only element of the story that never changed. Late at night, detectives who had lived with the case sometimes replayed it not as evidence, but as possibility, wondering what single moment, what overlooked sound or dismissed instinct, might have altered everything. And those thoughts lingered longest because they had no answers. The story did not end with justice or injustice, but with endurance, the endurance of memory, of doubt, of the human need to impose meaning on events that resist it. And that endurance was its own quiet indictment, not of individuals, but of the limits within which truth operates. California moved on, as it always does, traffic flowing, lights blinking, lives intersecting and separating without notice. And somewhere in that movement, the cold case remained, not solved, not unsolved, but suspended, a reminder etched into collective consciousness that some nights do not release their secrets. And so the final echo of the story was not a declaration, not a conclusion, but a question that refused to disappear, lingering in the background of every retelling, every archive, every quiet street that looks safe until it isn't, asking softly, relentlessly, what really happened when no one was watching, and whether the truth, once delayed long enough, ever fully arrives at all. Years later, when new detectives inherited the file, they noticed something their predecessors had grown used to overlooking, not a missing document or a mislabeled photo, but a pattern of certainty that arrived too early, conclusions forming before all questions had finished asking themselves. It wasn't negligence, it was human nature, the quiet urge to bring chaos into order, to draw a line where none naturally exists. And once that line is drawn, everything else tends to arrange itself around it, even doubt. A fresh review began slowly, not with bold announcements or press releases, but with silence, long hours spent rereading witness statements as if they were hearing them for the first time, listening for hesitations, contradictions, the small verbal stumbles that reveal more than polished recollections ever do. One detail resurfaced repeatedly, a minor timeline discrepancy dismissed years earlier as stress or faulty memory, but now viewed through a modern analytical lens, it suggested overlap, the possibility that two key events once thought separate may have occurred closer together than anyone realized. That realization didn't overturn the case, but it loosened it, like a knot tugged just enough to remind you it was never fully secure, and suddenly, alternative sequences no longer felt implausible, just inconvenient. Technology had changed too, not dramatically in one leap, but incrementally, refining its ability to read what time had blurred. And while no new evidence emerged intact, fragments once considered inert now carried statistical weight, subtle enough to demand caution, strong enough to demand attention. The prosecution's narrative, once airtight in presentation, began to show hairline fractures under this renewed pressure, not enough to collapse it, but enough to make certainty feel less absolute, more conditional. For the family, this reopening was not relief, but disruption, because reopening a cold case does not reopen hope alone. It reopens grief, forcing old wounds to negotiate space with new possibilities that may never materialize. They agreed to cooperate anyway, not because they believed in resolution, but because belief had nothing to do with it anymore. Cooperation had become a form of endurance, a way to keep moving without expecting arrival. Public interest returned cautiously this time, shaped by documentaries and long-form journalism rather than headlines. The tone less accusatory, more contemplative, as if society itself had matured enough to admit that some truths resist being packaged cleanly. Experts debated probabilities on panels and podcasts, emphasizing margins of error, confidence intervals, responsible doubt, and in doing so, they revealed an uncomfortable reality, that modern tools can illuminate uncertainty just as effectively as they illuminate answers. The suspect, now far removed from the person first accused, listened to these discussions from a distance, the case no longer defining his daily life, yet never entirely absent, because once a name enters public record attached to a cold case, it never fully detaches. He had learned over decades that innocence and guilt are not experienced symmetrically. Innocence demands patience, guilt demands concealment, but public perception often grants neither the luxury of time. As the review progressed, investigators found themselves facing a familiar crossroads, whether to pursue a theory that complicated everything or preserve one that, while imperfect, offered stability. And this choice, more than any piece of evidence, revealed the quiet power dynamics within the justice system. Nothing definitive emerged, no revelation dramatic enough to rewrite history, but the absence of certainty itself became the finding, formally acknowledged in internal reports that rarely reached the public eye. The cold case, once framed as a puzzle waiting to be solved, now appeared more honestly as a narrative shaped by limitations, assumptions, and the passage of time, and recognizing that did not weaken it, it clarified it. Because clarity does not always mean answers. Sometimes it means accepting that the truth exists somewhere beyond recovery, fragmented across moments that cannot be reassembled no matter how carefully they are examined. And in that acceptance, the case reached its most truthful state, not resolved, not abandoned, but understood for what it was, a human story interrupted, then reshaped by the imperfect systems tasked with explaining it. As files were once again returned to storage, updated but still incomplete, the detectives closed the cabinets gently, aware that closure, like truth, is not something you declare. It is something you learn to live without. The cold case remained open in status, but transformed in meaning, no longer a promise of answers, but a reminder that time does not just erode evidence, it reshapes certainty itself. Time kept moving, indifferent to files and findings, indifferent to the quiet weight carried by those who still remembered the night when everything fractured. Because time does not solve cold cases, It only teaches people how to carry them. The street where it happened looks ordinary now, repaved sidewalks, new paint on old houses, trees taller than they used to be, their roots deep enough to crack concrete, as if even the ground has been trying to surface what was buried beneath it. New families live there, unaware of how many times that address has been spoken in interrogation rooms, court transcripts, late-night phone calls. Unaware that for years it existed as a coordinate of fear, a place whispered rather than named. Detectives who once worked the case have retired, some moved away, some passed on, taking with them instincts and impressions that were never written down, the intangible parts of investigation that no database can recover. What remains are documents, recordings, evidence logs, and gaps where certainty should be, gaps where memory has thinned into suggestion. And those gaps hum quietly, like static behind every attempted conclusion. Every few years, the case resurfaces, triggered by a podcast episode, a viral clip, a documentary teaser promising answers it cannot deliver, and for a brief moment, the community leans in again, hoping this time will be different. Tips come in, as they always do, some sincere, some misremembered, some born from dreams mistaken for recollection. Each one logged, each one evaluated, most of them fading back into silence without explanation. Investigators follow procedure, because procedure is what remains when certainty is gone, but even procedure begins to feel ceremonial after enough time passes. A ritual performed to honor effort rather than expectation. The victim's name still appears in databases marked unsolved, a digital echo of a life reduced to a case number. And yet behind that number exists a personality frozen in time. Laughter that no longer belongs to the present, plans that never learned they would not be completed. For the family, anniversaries do not soften, they sharpen, each year adding distance from the person they lost and closeness to the version of them that exists only in memory, preserved and unchanged. They no longer ask when the case will be solved, that question exhausted itself long ago, replaced by a quieter one, whether the truth, if it ever surfaces, will still feel like truth after so much time has passed. In private moments, investigators admit what rarely appears in reports, that some cases are not unsolved because of missing evidence, but because the answer exists in a space no longer reachable, a moment that passed unseen and unrecorded. The cold case remains, not as a failure, but as a warning, a reminder of how fragile certainty is, how quickly a moment can slip beyond retrieval, how easily assumptions can harden into history. It lives on in training manuals, in cautionary lectures to new detectives, in footnotes about bias, tunnel vision, and the danger of early conclusions, lessons written in absence rather than resolution. And still, somewhere, the truth exists, not as a clean narrative, not as a courtroom revelation, but as a sequence of actions that once happened and cannot unhappen, whether or not they are ever named. That truth does not need belief to be real. It only needs to have occurred, and the universe offers no guarantee that it will ever be known. So the case waits, not patiently, not expectantly, but quietly, like a question left unanswered on purpose, shaping everyone who passes near it without demanding anything in return. A cold case does not end. It settles into the fabric of a community, into the caution of investigators, into the understanding that justice is an aspiration, not a promise. And as long as the file remains open, even untouched, it stands as proof that some stories are not meant to conclude, only to be remembered, unresolved, unsettling, and painfully human. The silence around the case grows heavier with age, not because people have forgotten, but because they have learned where memory hurts the most, and they instinctively step around it. In police archives, the file sits among hundreds of others, its spine faded, its label updated with newer fonts and newer systems, but inside, the same old questions remain, unchanged, unanswered, waiting. Occasionally, a junior investigator stumbles across it while searching for something else, pauses longer than necessary, reads more than required, and for a moment, the past flickers back to life. They notice how confident the early notes sound, how decisive the language is, how little room there seems to be for doubt, and that confidence feels strange now, almost alien, like a voice from another era that believed certainty was easier than it is. They see the photographs, grainy and clinical, and try to imagine the sounds that never made it into evidence, the air in the room, the tension that no report can fully capture. There is always that one detail, the one that refuses to settle, a timestamp that doesn't align, a statement that feels rehearsed, a gap that no amount of logic can bridge, and that detail lingers longer than all the rest. Supervisors advise restraint, reminding them how many times hope has surged and collapsed around this case, how reopening old wounds can create new ones without healing the original. Still, curiosity persists, because curiosity is the enemy of closure and the ally of truth, even when truth has nowhere left to go. Outside the station, the world has changed completely, technology faster, cities louder, attention spans shorter, yet the unresolved nature of the case feels oddly modern, perfectly suited to an age that understands ambiguity. True crime audiences debate it endlessly online, dissecting transcripts, enhancing audio, mapping timelines with digital precision, convinced that collective effort might succeed where institutions did not. Some argue innocence, others guilt, camps forming around interpretations rather than facts, proof that uncertainty does not discourage belief, it multiplies it. The victim becomes a symbol in these spaces, less a person than a narrative anchor, and those who knew them feel a quiet resentment toward this transformation, this public ownership of private loss. They remember the voice, the habits, the small details that never mattered to investigators but mattered to love, and no theory online can touch that reality. As years continue to pass, legal thresholds shift, statutes evolve, evidence standards rise, and paradoxically, the window for resolution narrows even as tools improve. What once might have been enough is no longer sufficient, and what could be sufficient no longer exists, lost to time, decay, or simple human error. The cold case exists now in a strange state of suspension, technically active, emotionally dormant, resurfacing only when something external disturbs the still water. And each disturbance leaves ripples that fade faster than the last, as if even the case itself is learning the rhythm of disappearance. Yet disappearance is not erasure, it is transformation. And the case transforms again and again, from investigation to legend, from legend to lesson, from lesson to warning. It warns that truth is fragile, that justice depends not only on facts but on timing, perspective, and restraint. And once those slip out of alignment, no force can easily bring them back. So the file remains where it is, closed but not concluded, silent but not empty, holding within it the weight of everything that was missed, everything that might have been, and everything that will never be known. At some point, the case stops belonging to any single person, and becomes a shadow shared by everyone who touches it. A weight passed quietly from one generation to the next without ceremony or consent. New detectives read the file knowing its reputation before they know its facts, warned in advance that this is the kind of cold case that resists resolution, not because of one fatal mistake, but because of dozens of small ones that align just long enough to matter. They approach it carefully, almost respectfully, as if raising their voices might disturb something fragile that has already survived too much attention. There is a temptation to believe that one overlooked detail still exists, something hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes, the right mindset, the right moment, and that belief keeps the file from being permanently sealed. But belief alone does not create evidence, and hope does not reverse time. It only sharpens the awareness of what time has taken. Witnesses who once sounded confident now speak through layers of distance, their memories softened, rearranged, sometimes unknowingly rewritten by years of retelling. Some no longer answer calls, others no longer remember why they once mattered, and a few are no longer alive to be asked anything at all. Physical evidence rests in climate-controlled rooms, preserved but not protected from relevance, because relevance erodes even when material does not. What once seemed conclusive now reads as circumstantial. What once felt damning now feels ambiguous. And ambiguity is the natural climate of a cold case. The justice system prefers endings, verdicts, signatures on paper that declare something finished, but this case refuses to cooperate with that instinct. It lingers instead as an unresolved chord, never fully fading, never fully resolving, always slightly out of tune with the present. For the community, the case has become a reference point, a story parents once told in lowered voices, a reminder of vulnerability passed down as caution rather than fear. The name of the victim still carries weight, spoken carefully, respectfully, as if volume itself might cross an invisible line. There is no closure ceremony, no final announcement, no moment where the past releases its grip, only a gradual acceptance that some questions survive longer than the people who ask them. Investigators eventually stop promising answers and start promising diligence, a quieter commitment, less dramatic but more honest. They keep the file accessible, not because they expect resolution, but because forgetting would feel like a second crime. And so the case remains open, technically, symbolically, emotionally, suspended between what is known and what will never be proven. It exists as evidence of effort as much as evidence of failure, a testament to how complex truth becomes once it passes through human systems. A cold case is not frozen in time. It moves slowly, changing shape as society changes around it, reflecting new fears, new values, new doubts. And somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the speculation, beneath the theories, beneath the decades of waiting, lies a moment that happened once and will never happen again, complete, unaltered, unreachable. That moment does not care whether it is understood. It simply exists. And the case, unfinished and unresolved, continues to orbit that moment forever. A reminder that not all stories end. Some simply endure, quietly, indefinitely, hauntingly unfinished. Even now, decades removed from the night everything unraveled, the case has a way of resurfacing without warning, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet corners where unresolved things tend to linger. A detective hears the victim's name during training, not as a headline, but as an example, a cautionary note about assumptions and momentum, about how quickly an investigation can narrow and how difficult it is to widen it again. A journalist stumbles across the file while researching something else, reads a little too long, feels that familiar pull, the unease that comes from realizing how many answers were once expected and how few ever arrived. The case has become a reference point for absence, proof that effort and outcome do not always align, that diligence does not guarantee resolution, only integrity. Those closest to it have learned to live with that imbalance, to accept that justice, in practice, often looks nothing like justice in theory. There are moments when the possibility of truth feels close again, a new technology announced, a new database connected, a new method promising clarity where there was once only noise. For a brief time, hope stirs, cautious and restrained, careful not to grow too large, because experience has taught everyone involved what happens when hope outruns evidence. Tests are run, comparisons made, margins calculated, and then slowly, the excitement settles into something quieter, more familiar. The results are inconclusive. Again. Not wrong, not useless, just insufficient. Another reminder that progress does not always move in straight lines, and sometimes it circles the same unanswered questions with better tools, but the same limits. The family is informed, gently, professionally, with language chosen to avoid promises, and they receive the news the way they have learned to receive all news about the case, with composure shaped by long practice. They thank the investigators not because they expect more, but because acknowledgement has replaced expectation, gratitude replacing anticipation. For them, the case no longer represents a future revelation. It represents a past that refuses to fully settle, a chapter that never learned how to end. In the community, the story has faded into background knowledge, something vaguely remembered, resurfacing only when prompted, like a scar noticed only when touched. Yet its influence remains, subtle but real, shaping how people lock their doors, how they look at strangers, how they understand the thin line between ordinary nights and irreversible ones. The case has taught them that violence does not always announce itself, that danger can arrive quietly, without warning, without witnesses. Investigators understand this too, perhaps better than anyone, and that understanding follows them into every new case, every new crime scene, every decision shaped by the memory of what went wrong here. In that way, the cold case continues to work, not by delivering answers, but by altering behavior, sharpening caution, deepening humility. It stands as proof that uncertainty is not the opposite of knowledge, but part of it, an essential reminder of the limits of perception and reconstruction. The file remains open, not because resolution is expected, but because openness itself has become the point, a refusal to declare the unknowable irrelevant. And so the case endures, not frozen, not finished, but present, woven into the professional conscience of those who study it and the private grief of those who lived it. It exists in that narrow space between memory and mystery, where answers are no longer demanded, only respected for their absence. A cold case does not ask to be solved. It asks to be remembered.